I'm a big, bad, radical liberal who believes in socialism and wants to take all your stuff away. Okay, all joking aside, that's not true. Liberals don't want to take all your stuff away, and socialism has really been misunderstood in the United States for decades. And it's something that I studied in college, something that I have a little bit of an understanding of, so that's what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the history of socialism, how it started, and what socialism really is. I hope you'll stay with me because I think a lot of you are going to be really surprised about what I'm going to talk about today and hopefully what we're going to learn. Hi, my name is Carolyn Rose, and welcome back to another episode of As I See It. This is my second channel where I get to talk about all the things that I love and that many of you love, so kind of anything goes, but really it's about social and political issues and equal rights and all those things, and I like to give a historical perspective on a lot of issues that we are facing in America and around the world today. And today I want to talk about socialism. I studied Russia and the Cold War and World War II and economics in college, so this is something that I'm really interested in, and I was really excited to do this video. A lot of you have been asking for it. In order to get a full understanding of what socialism is, of course, we have to go back and look at history, because like so many things in history, the truth is buried oftentimes or rewritten. Remember when I did the video about the Confederate monuments and we talked about how Confederate Civil War history was literally rewritten by the Lost Cause and the Daughters of the Confederacy? And if you didn't see that video, check it out. It's very much the same here when we talk about socialism. So socialism is a fairly new concept as far as world history, but we need to go back and we need to understand how socialism came about. And we're going to go back to the Middle Ages here for a minute, and we're going to talk about feudalism. Feudalism was a social and economic system which kept society organized and somewhat stable, and it kept commerce going. And feudalism existed in Europe between about 400 AD for 1,000 years till about 1400 AD. And under feudalism, the kings owned all the land. And then there was, and I'm not going to get into, it's a long, detailed, complex system, and I'm just going to give you the abridged version today, very simplified for the purposes of the conversation on socialism today. But basically, the way it worked is the kings owned the land, their kingdom, and then they gave out parcels of their land to different levels of the hierarchy, basically, of society at the time. They gave a land to a duke, and in return for that land to the duke, the duke gave them loyalty, gave them armed forces, gave them troops when they needed to fight other kingdoms, gave them taxes money because the duke then was able to parse out their land. And basically it all whittled down to the king up here, the dukes. There were dukes, there were bishops, there were knights, there were lords. There was a whole hierarchy beneath the king of people who managed the land within the kingdom. And for every layer of that hierarchy, the people beneath them owed the person above them loyalty and their services, whether it was for an army or for working the land. And basically it all boiled down to the king up here, a bunch of middlemen here, and then the peasants here at the very bottom. And the peasants at the very bottom were basically leased land, kind of, and then they were charged taxes. So basically the peasants had to work the land, and this is again very simplistic view of it. They had to work the land and they were levied taxes, and oftentimes what happened is the peasants, who were the most of the people in these kingdoms by far, just like it is now, the working people are the masses, while the elite, the middlemen, and those at the top are fewer. But those people in the middle and at the top controlled the peasants, and the peasants had to work really, really hard in order to pay their taxes. So they worked the land that they didn't own in order to pay taxes to the people above them, and then oftentimes very, very little was left for them to live on. So they basically stayed in abject poverty most of the time. Most of them did. I mean, there were a few who probably broke out, but that was basically the structure in feudal medieval Europe, is that you had the peasants at the bottom who did all the work, and they were the poorest, while everybody above them was getting rich on their labor. And they didn't even own the land that they worked, but that was often passed down from generation to generation. And that's the other thing about the feudal system, is that those in power, the kings and the dukes and everything, and the lords, and by the way, that's where the term landlord comes from. The lords oversaw the land, and then the peasants had to pay the lord of the land in order to live on that land, basically, and they never owned it, so that's where landlord comes from. And the county comes from counts. When counts were given pieces of land to manage for the king, they then had people within their county. That's where that word comes from. Kind of interesting, huh? So we have modern day landlords and counties, which come from medieval feudalist Europe. They were able to keep the system in place for centuries because they controlled the church, and the church told the peasants that this is a preordained order, that your lot in life, that your station in life is preordained by God, that God has given kings the power over the land, and it is your responsibility to serve the king by working the land and giving your money and your taxes and your loyalty to the king. So that was medieval Europe. That's kind of how we all started, the mindset of economics and social structure, and being ordained by God, this order that was also protection for the peasants. They had the armies of all the middlemen and the king, so there was also a level of protection there. But what they didn't have is freedom. If you were born a peasant, you were a peasant. There was no moving up. A peasant couldn't become a lord. A peasant couldn't become a count. A count couldn't become a king. It was very predetermined, and like the church, the Catholic Church said, this is just the way God wants it, and don't cry about it. That's just your lot in life. And of course, that lot in life was inherited. If your parents were peasants, you were going to be a peasant. There was no upward mobility. It was just the way it was. Well, that lasted for about 1,000 years, and then the masses, the peasants, there's a lot that happened. Again, this is a very simplified version. They started to get a little restless. They started rising up. There were revolutions across Europe. I think it started first in England, and they said, no, I think that there started to be commerce in other areas, so they started to see the possibilities, and the Enlightenment started, and all these movements were starting to open up, and people were starting to become curious and to look at other forms of society, and the peasants rose up. And feudalism was first overthrown in England, and it took a while for it to spread across Europe. The really big one that we know about was when feudalism was overthrown in France in the French Revolution in 1787. And the revolutionaries in France made a very public statement about the end of feudalism. King Louis XVI was made an example of. The revolutionaries put him on public display and beheaded him. It was literally like the beheading of feudalism and the introduction of a new way of life. And what came in to replace feudalism was capitalism. And whereas feudalism was a system ordained by God, all about a community based on order, with the king at the top and the peasants at the bottom, capitalism promised a new thought about how society and economics should run based on the individual. So while so many of the poor peasants who rose up to fight against the lords and the kings and said, no, there has to be a better way, it was the whole era of Enlightenment, and people were starting to wake up to different ways of life and different ways of thinking, in came capitalism, which celebrated the individual. And this was so important, and it grabbed a hold so tightly because there was no individualism under feudalism. Feudalism was all about serving those above you, serving the king, serving God. And you don't question your lot in life. You don't question your station. That's just the way it is because of God. But then when Enlightenment came along and reason and thought and philosophy and different ways other than the Bible and the Catholic Church started to take hold, the peasants started seeing another way of life. And with that, the individual, the rise of the individual, that individuals, there is no preordained lot in life, that just because I'm born a peasant doesn't mean I have to stay a peasant. And capitalism promised this. Capitalism promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, which is brotherhood, which means that instead of there being this preordained hierarchy of living, that we are all brothers, that we can all live together as brothers, and we can have freedom and we can have equality. So that's what capitalism promised. That if you work really hard, then you are able to move up, that you can be anything you want to be, that you can earn money, that you can be free. So fast forward about 50 years from the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution is starting across Europe, and even in the United States is starting to take root. And what's happening is that those former peasants, or even the descendants of those peasants who were promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, are starting to realize that capitalism isn't delivering. We rushed in the Industrial Revolution, and we all know what happened during the Industrial Revolution. People were worked literally to death. They were working in mines in unsafe conditions. Children were put to work. Everybody was working crazy hours. And basically what happened is the rich capitalists took the place of the lords and the kings in the feudal system. It started to look very similar to the feudal system, right? You still had the lowly, poor workers at the bottom doing all the work, while the rich at the top were making all the money off of their labors and further exploiting them and making it really, really difficult for the workers at the bottom to get ahead. So I watched a Dave Ramsey clip about his views on socialism. And this is I think the big lie of capitalism. And it started way back then when they broke away from feudalism. The lie of capitalism is that anybody if you work hard enough, that's all you have to do. You have to work hard enough. There's no luck involved. There's no predisposition in life involved. It's not about what you inherited. It's not about how you were raised. It's not about the resources that were available to you in your upbringing. It's not about even your intelligence. It's about hard work. If you work hard enough, you too can be a wealthy capitalist. That's the number one lie that keeps us all in line in a capitalist system. And watching Dave Ramsey, he talked about how
I came from nothing, he says, and look at me, I'm now a millionaire.
Maybe he's a billionaire, and the guy, I'm not sure who he is, a Fox News host, said, yeah, me too. I came from nothing. I came from nothing, and look at me. If I did it, anybody could do it. So I did a little research on Dave Ramsey to see how did he really come from nothing? I was really curious at that point. Is this true? Did he really, really come from nothing, And it was hard to find because he buries his upbringing. As far as I can tell, he's a very good marketer in marketing his version of, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps, so can you. But it took some digging in one of his books, a very short passage in one of his books. So Dave Ramsey made all his money very young in real estate. He was very smart. He was very industrious. He knew how to make money. And he, very young, went after, he was very ambitious. He went after his goals. He made a lot of money to put himself through college. But by digging around, what I learned is that his parents were in real estate. So while he may have started with very little or no money, Dave Ramsey grew up in a household of real estate professionals. You don't think any of that rubbed off on him? You don't think it gave him any contacts in the real estate world, giving him a place to start? Well, it's all fine and dandy for Dave Ramsey to say, I became a millionaire and I started with nothing, while it's really fine and easy for somebody who came from a white middle class family to say, I started with nothing, when he probably had a decent education. He had parents who were in a profession that he later got into that was able to give him his fortune. But imagine living in an inner city, one parent's not there because he's in prison, because that's the way our system works. You're raised by a single mother who doesn't have a high school education and works a minimum wage job, and she's gone 60 hours a week just to put a roof over your head. You're in an inner city school which gets pennies to the dollar of a suburban school, or or imagine a private school. So you're probably not going to get the attention in school that a Dave Ramsey might have gotten. Your class size might be double what Dave Ramsey's was. So capitalist lie is that anybody, as long as you work hard, can get ahead, can become a millionaire, can thrive. Okay, then why do we have single mothers working 60, 70 hours a week to raise her kids alone? They work their asses off, but they're still living in poverty. If capitalism really delivers on that promise of, if you work hard enough, you can get ahead, why is 40% of America living in poverty? It's not that they're not working. It's not that they were not working hard enough. It's that we've got something else going on. And that's what the workers in the mid 1800s started seeing, that something is going on, that capitalism is not delivering all of the freedom, it's not delivering the liberty, the equality, and the fraternity that it promised. Here I am at the bottom, working my fingers to the bone, getting sick. My kids are working their finger to the bone, while this bigwig, rich capitalist sits up there counting all the money he's earning off my back. How is that any different from the king living in a luxurious castle while the peasants labor the land? And so this thing that capitalism promised to deliver and didn't is where socialism was born in the early to mid 1800s. And let me also make this point: socialism predates Karl Marx. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, for those of you who don't know, and Das Kapital, which are very good books. I highly recommend reading them. And it will really help you understand socialism and the structures of society and economics that really keep us, the workers, literally almost as slaves to the capitalists. It's a really important read, and I highly recommend anybody reading it with an open mind. And so Karl Marx came up idealizing the French Revolution and studying capitalism and understanding the early roots of socialism and how capitalism was failing. He actually came along much later with one school of thought about socialism. So basically, socialism arose from the failures of capitalism. Socialism came along to say, what about all these things that capitalism promised? I'm not seeing them. We're still having this major disparity in wealth and opportunity. So that's what socialism wanted to address. Capitalism came along to address the wrongs of feudalism. Nobody said it was going to be perfect. Nobody said it was going to be the end all be all. But they did promise liberty, equality, and fraternity, and they didn't deliver it. And it's still not delivering it. We are now a couple hundred years into capitalism, and we are seeing disparities in income that are just phenomenal. Did you know that there are like 80 to 100 billionaires in the world who own more wealth than the bottom half? Okay, let's round up. 100 people in the world own more wealth than the bottom 50%. Does that sound like a system that's working to you? Does that sound like equality to you? An opportunity? When so few people are able to rise to the top to beat out the bottom 50%, does that sound like equal opportunity? No, it's not. That means 100 people own more wealth than 3.5 billion people on this planet. That is the main accomplishment of capitalism. That's what capitalism has given us. So when you think that 100 people are able to own more wealth than 3.5 billion people, does it sound like anybody who works hard enough can get ahead? Or are those branch it out to 1,000 who own who knows how much wealth? It sounds to me like they're exploiting the bottom in order to stay on top. We're going to get to that in a minute. The other thing about capitalism is built into capitalism is an idea, an understanding that we're going to have a downturn every 4 to 7 years. That's built into capitalism, that the market needs to correct itself and that we're going to have a recession where people are going to lose jobs, they're going to lose savings, they're going to lose the retirement money every 4 to 7 years. Does that sound like a system that's working? And especially those on the bottom are the hardest hit, okay? When you have $50 billion in the bank and you lose 10%, you can still survive. But when you have no money in the bank and you're living a minimum wage job and you're living paycheck to paycheck and you lose your job because of an economic downturn, that really hits hard. So again, we've ended up with a system that's not that different from the feudal system, except now the capitalists have replaced the kings and the workers have replaced the peasants and the serfs, and we're working hard to enrich the people at the top. Socialism came along and said, okay, this individualism, this idea that if everybody just goes after their own selfish interests. Adams, who was a big political philosopher and economist of the time, said, yeah, that's true. If everybody pursues their own selfish interest, that is going to be for the best of mankind. Thomas Hobbes came along and said, no, that's going to create chaos and anarchy and income inequality and all kinds of terrible things for most of humanity. And it turns out that Hobbes was right. Pursuing our selfish interest is what got us where we are today, where 100 people own more wealth than 3.5 billion people on the planet, where we have people working 3 jobs minimum wage and are living paycheck to paycheck, while Jeff Bezos is earning $10 billion or whatever he's earning. The owner of Amazon is earning massive profits. His profits increased exponentially during COVID, and he's taking away sick care for his employees. That's what individualism gets us. Me, 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 me. That's what individualism has gotten us under the guise of capitalism. Capitalism also got us the Great Depression. Got us the big, huge market crash, this 4 to 7 year cycle where things are going to go bad. Well, things went really, really bad in the 1930s. We had the worst depression we've ever had. And the reason it was so bad is because we didn't have any protections for workers. We didn't have protections for the average person. The capitalist bigwigs were rolling along, counting their money on the backs of all the workers, and then the economic crash hit, and people were hit really hard. So in 1930s, we had a socialist party, we had a communist party. It was okay in the 1930s for the socialists and the communists to live side by side. They were another party like the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and no one felt that they were trying to that they were enemies of the state, that they were trying to do away with modern society. Instead, it was more of a back and forth, and it was like, okay, well, we believe this, and maybe more of a negotiation. Those parties got together, the Socialist Party, the Communist Party, some other organizations that were trying to help the average person, and worked with FDR to create the New Deal. Under the New Deal, jobs were created. Social Security was put in place. I think the FDIC, which protected people's deposits in the bank because there were no protections back then. That's why we had this great crash and the depression. There were no protections for the consumer putting their money in banks, and so people lost all of their savings overnight. FDR and the New Deal and the Socialist and Communist Party put these protections in place in order to help the average person. Social Security, unemployment insurance, and things like that. But guess who paid for that? The rich people. All of these programs were paid for by taxing the rich. And they couldn't have that. No. FDR's New Deal pulled America out of depression by just levying a little extra tax on the people at the highest levels, and it brought prosperity, it brought jobs, it brought us out of the depression. And what happened? The rich people were like, oh yeah, no, we're not having any of that. No, 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 no. So in 1933, FDR implements the New Deal, which puts millions of Americans back to work. And there are also now some social parachutes, some safety nets in place. And by 1935, a coalition of business owners, bankers, and other rich capitalists said, nope, enough of that. We definitely cannot have any more of these social programs at our expense. And so they started a campaign to disband both the Socialist and the Communist parties. Now, like I said, remember, Socialist and Communist parties were completely acceptable in the early 1900s. In the early 1930s. We had a Socialist Democratic Party, and those parties are the ones who helped FDR put in some of these safety nets for people like you and me, for the workers. But the bigwigs were like, yeah, no, they're taking away our profits. We're taking away shareholder profits. We can't have any of that. And so, like rich people have so often done, those in power, those with the money, like they do in American history, they change the narrative. They start telling people that socialism is the same as communism, which was seeing a rise in Europe and starting to really scare people. They convinced people that they were all the same, and within a few short years, they literally, through their efforts, got both the Socialist Party and the Communist parties disbanded in America. And then from then on, from the mid-1930s until today, they have literally made socialism taboo. This was all a propaganda effort. This was all similar to the lost cause after the Civil War. This was all about lying to us, basically, in order to keep their wealth. They couldn't have these socialist parties having power to put in safety nets for the people when it was going to cost them a little bit of money. I mean, they weren't the ones who suffered during the Great Depression. It was the workers. And yet they had to get rid of all of the organizations, all the coalitions, the parties that were benefiting the people. Even in the 1950s, Truman in a speech said that socialism is the epithet that they, the rich or whoever, threw at all forms of public power. So any form of public power is what Truman called it. And they threw the word socialism or communism on it as a way to demonize it. Public power. He also said, this is Truman, Harry S. Truman also said that whenever a Republican candidate claims down with socialism, what he really means is down with progress. That's what Truman said in the 1950s. And then, of course, once we saw the Russian form of socialism take hold in Eastern Europe during World War II, it just became an absolute taboo, that it was not allowed to be talked about in America. And in fact, one of the professors that I listened to a few of his lectures for this video, Dr. Wolf, he studied at Yale, Harvard, and I think Princeton, and he's about 10 years older than me. He studied economics. He's never read Karl Marx. These so-called liberal institutions, and Dave Ramsey said that in the interview that I watched. He was like, all these liberal institutions are teaching socialism, which is absolutely not true. A renowned American socialist who went to 3 of these liberal elite universities never read Karl Marx, which I read Karl Marx. I'm a little bit later than him, but I find that really fascinating. While Karl Marx, and a lot of people make the mistake of equating socialism, communism, Marxism, fascism. I think they think they're all the same. They are not, and I'm going to talk about that next. So like I said, socialism was a response to the failures of capitalism. Capitalism promised equality, liberty, and fraternity, and instead we saw the same inequities that we saw in feudalism. And so socialism came along and said, okay, well, instead of the individualism of capitalism, instead of this idea that if we all chase our own personal interests, it'll be good for society, which is not working out. Let's look at the society as a whole. Let's look at what can benefit society. It's more of a global, not global like outside the United States, but more of a community effort. Maybe if we social is about social, right? Capitalism is about the individual capitalist and making money, and it's really what it was about, right? It's about the individual and money, whereas socialism is more about society, social society, building a society that works for everyone. And when socialism started to kind of come up in the ranks of philosophers and political scientists and economists, and people started trying to find something that might be better or might fix the wrongs of capitalism, socialism came about. But there were quickly 2 schools of thought in the socialist world. There were the revolutionary socialists and there were the evolutionary socialists. And that's where Karl Marx came along. Karl Marx saw the problems with capitalism and saw that the capitalism was never going to go away as long as we had the rich capitalists in control of everything. They were in control of economy. They were in control of enterprise. They were in control of industry. And as we now know, and they even knew it this 150, 200 years ago, capitalists were also in control of the government. And now we've got lobbyists. I'd love to do a video on lobbyists, but we've got lobbyists, and we know that our politicians are often bought and sold on both sides. Because of the way our political system works and needing re-election, we have too many government officials who are beholden on the capitalists, big business, the rich people. Karl Marx saw that. All the other socialists in the mid-1800s saw that. It was even happening then. And if we have, and we just use this as an example, 10 people owning more wealth than 50% of everyone else, they've got all the power. They have all the power to influence policy, to influence workers and workers' rules and rights and labor laws. They have all the power. Karl Marx recognized that these capitalists have all the power. And Karl Marx also recognized capitalists were not going to let go of that power without a fight. There's no way we're just going to be able to appeal to their good side, right? Appeal to their social side, appeal to the community side. We weren't going to be able to do that because capitalism is all about the pursuit of my greed, the pursuit of my interests is better for the whole. That's what capitalists believe, trickle-down economics, right? That if we treat the richest the best, it's all going to trickle down, which has been debunked a million times, by the way. And Karl Marx said, there's no way those capitalists are going to give up that power. There is no way. The only way to do it, and again, remember, I said as a young man, he was intrigued with and maybe romanticized the French Revolution. So Karl Marx wrote that the only way to take power away from the rich capitalists and give it to the people was through violent revolution. That's Marxist socialism. That is not socialism. While Marx is over here writing this, and even before that, there was another school of socialism thought, which was not revolutionary, not based on revolution, but based on evolution. Evolution meaning that it's a peaceful process. It's a peaceful transition. It's just something that evolves over time. What both the Marx revolutionary socialism believed and the evolutionary socialism believed is that in order to make change for the workers, for the average person, to put it in modern terms, for that 5.5 billion people on the planet who own less wealth than 100 people, is first we have to seize the government. We have to seize power. We have to take control, because right now, this is 150 years ago, and it's so true today. But what both the evolutionary socialists and the revolutionary socialists saw was that even in a democratic capitalist society, it's not democratic because the capitalists have all the money and all the power. And that needed to change. And they both said in order for that to change, instead of the capitalists having the power over the government, the socialists, the people, need to have power over the government. That's all socialism is. It means giving the people the power over what's produced, how it's produced, and how the profits are distributed. Right now, there's a board of directors and an owner of a company, a CEO, who make all those decisions. They make all those decisions for the top, basically to benefit the shareholders at the expense of the workers. Jeff Bezos is a great example. He is making decisions at the top of Amazon to maximize profits, that's capitalism, for the shareholders, and screw the tens of thousands of employees. I don't know how many people are on the board or how many shareholders. I don't know how many shareholders Amazon has, but I'm going to tell you it's a small fraction of the number of workers. So all the thousands of workers are, during a pandemic, losing health care, losing paid sick leave, and I think that's what it is, losing paid sick leave, working longer hours, putting themselves at risk, while those at the top are making decisions that risk their lives just so that they can make more money. And socialism says, you know what? That's wrong. Why should they be profiting off the labor, the health, the well-being of the worker? And the worker has no say in the matter. The worker has no say in the matter. Sure, we get a vote. But does that really, we're seeing that now. Does that really change anything? When it's the money that's buying the politicians, it's buying the laws, it's buying the bills, it's buying everything else behind the scenes? Socialism wants to give that power back to the people. And how do they do that? They put people in charge of businesses. They put people in charge of what's produced, how it's produced, and how the profits are distributed. Think about unions, trade unions. Trade unions are very much about that form of socioeconomic structure. Co-ops. You ever shop at a co-op? A food co-op? They're structured that way. Employee-owned companies are structured that way, where there's not one boss, one CEO dictating everything to the workers. It's the workers working together to decide what's best for. And imagine if we have workers making these decisions instead of CEOs only caring about lining the pockets of the shareholders. We would have better environmental restrictions and better environmental, right? Better water, better schools. I mean, there's a million things that would probably be better if we could decide where the profits go instead of making billionaires even richer. Imagine if the people ran those companies and said, you know what, instead let's put 10% into the schools in our neighborhood. Let's put 10% into daycare for those who are, working here. Imagine what could be done if we, the people, had the power to decide where the profits of our labor go. Imagine that. That's what socialism is. There's this idea. So here's what happened. Marxist socialism is revolutionary, and that's exactly what Lenin did in Russia. After World War I, Russia was decimated. They got slaughtered in World War I. Russia was suffering a lot economically and socially. They were beat up. And so it was the perfect environment. Lenin, by the way, had been in prison. Lenin went to prison for telling the Russian people not to go to war. He was like, this war that's being fought is for the capitalists. This is industrialists. This is capitalists. They're fighting over stuff that has nothing to do with us. So don't go fight for these rich people. Sound familiar? How many wars have we fought over oil that are making oil people and industrialists rich and killing our youth, killing our young men and women? So that's what Lenin said. Lenin's like, no, don't go fight their war. Why are you fighting their war? This is between them. They're fighting over money and property and stuff, and this has nothing to do with you. And he went to jail for that. And so did an American socialist, by the way, and I can't remember his name, but during the same time, an American socialist was saying the same thing, and he also went to jail. So Vladimir Lenin went to prison. And when he came out of prison, Russia was suffering the effects of losing World War I. And so it was the perfect environment for Lenin to go in, revolutionary style, and take over Russia, which he did, to form a more socialist country. And what happened is, the first step of socialism is, there's two steps. The first step is to seize power. You can't make change until you seize control. Revolutionary thinks you do it violently. Evolutionary thinks you do it within the system. That you have a party, you get support, you get votes, you get elected into office. It's kind of what we're seeing in the United States, right? Where we want people with more socialist views in office. So that's the evolutionary, that we do it, we work within the system, we don't overthrow the system. Well, Lenin happened to be a Marxist, and so he went in, he overthrew the system, and he took control of the government. The second stage of socialism is, once you have power, then you start making change. You seize power, and then you implement change. You can't do it overnight. It's going to take a while, but basically it's about transforming a capitalist system in which only the richest capitalists own everything and control all the people and the government. It's a transformation from transferring the power from the capitalists to the people. And that was Lenin's vision. So Lenin's vision was to seize power and then make the transformation and replace the government from private capitalists to the people. But what happened is he caused a split even deeper within the socialist movement. Those who were behind Lenin and supported the revolutionary takeover of the government, and those who didn't. And since Lenin came out and claimed this is socialism, the evolutionary socialists had to break off. They had to distance themselves from this revolutionary version of socialism. And so that's when communism was born. The socialists who did not want to be seen as revolutionary and violent broke off from the socialist movement and became communists. All the communist parties started in 1920, 1921. And that's what the Communist Party was about. Basically, socialism without the revolution, without the violence. Unfortunately, Lenin only got halfway through the process of becoming a socialist nation. He seized the economy. He took everything away from private capitalists and put it under the control of the state. This is not what socialism is. What he did is he took everything away from the capitalists and gave it to the state. So all the capitalists fled Russia, all the industrialists, all the entrepreneurs, they fled because they no longer had anything because the government took it away. And he never followed through with the second part of that, which was then to transfer all that power to the people. So what happened is in 1931, Lenin is dead, Stalin declares this is socialism. State-run, government-run industry, this is socialism, he said. Stalin never went through with the second part of the process of socializing a country. He seized power, he gave power to the state, and he ended it there and called it socialism. And if you want to listen to Dr. Wolf's lecture below, there's a lot more about that, and it's pretty fascinating. But basically, so in 1931, Lenin says, okay, the state seized all private property, it seized all industry, it seized the economy. Woohoo, we've made it. This is socialism. And that is what the world started to believe was socialism. That is what the United States still believes is socialism. I have said in other videos, I studied Russia, I studied Karl Marx, I studied Eastern Europe and a lot of other communist nations, and I said, we have never seen true socialism. People look to Venezuela, people look to Russia, people look to Cuba and say socialism doesn't work. Socialism has never been tried. They've only gotten halfway there and then stopped. This is not socialism. Socialism is not government control of industry and the economy. Socialism is social control, our control, the people's control. That is not at all what Russia had. So there are different forms of capitalism. You can have private capitalism, where private industrialists and capitalists own everything and then employ the people and distribute the profits. You can have public capitalism. Public capitalism is where the state owns something and employs the people and makes the profits and distributes the profits. What Stalin had in Russia was not socialism, it was public, it was state capitalism. That's what it was. It was no different. He still had worker bee people who worked for the government. They had no stake in anything. They had no stake in the industry. They had no say. It was dictated by the state. And so again, we went through feudalism, where the kings owned all the industry and the serfs and the peasants worked for the king. That was replaced by capitalism, where we had capitalists who owned everything and the workers who worked for the capitalist, the rich capitalist. Then we had Lenin and Stalin taking over Russia and seizing everything from the capitalists. And then the state became the owner, employing all the workers. So it's just another form of capitalism. That's it. It's not socialism. Does that make sense? Kind of cool and fascinating, isn't it? There was no major transformation in Stalinist Russia. There was no major improvement for the workers. They were just working for a different boss. So in reality, people look to Russia and all the crap and all the horrible things. Russia was unproductive and they lost their economic world standing and all of this because they say socialism, communism failed. It didn't. State capitalism failed. It proved that the state was horrible at running industry. People weren't incented to work hard. It wasn't about the people. It was about the state. It was about rebuilding Russia after the horrible losses of World War I. You can't look at Russia and say that socialism failed. You can look at Russia and say capitalism failed yet again, because that's the truth. That's the reality. For the next 100 years, from the 1940s until today, Americans, and those who know better but still want you to fear socialism, have looked at Russia and said socialism and communism have failed. Look at Russia. All you have to do is look at Russia, look at Venezuela. Socialism has failed. And I'm going to go back to what I've always said since college. No, socialism has not failed because we've never had true socialism. And democratic socialism is something that the United States has been moving more toward, which is a democratic government and a socialist socioeconomic system in which more decisions about the welfare and the state of the workers is in the hands of the workers and not the elite with all the power and all the money. How can that be a bad thing? Why can't the United States go along the lines of many of the European countries? France has three branches of government that are run by the Socialist Party. There are socialist parties all across Europe in government now with power and seats in their parliaments and their congresses. It's only the United States, or at least one of the few, who still has this huge, waving this carrot of this skeleton of fear over Americans to fear socialism. And where do you think that comes from? 1930s, any progress for the people, the workers, you and I, who work our fingers to the bone to enrich the people at the top, we're the ones who are suffering when we fear socialism. They're benefiting. They continue to profit. You think that might be the goal? I do. So much of our fear about socialism comes from the Cold War and the Red Scare, and I'll probably talk all about that in another video. But really, I think it's just important to understand the foundations of teaching us to fear socialism are in rich people in the 1930s who were upset that they were taxed. Our fear of socialism and the fear mongering was a conscious effort to keep us in line, to keep us working hard to enrich those in power. So it's kind of crazy to think, isn't it, that our ideas and what we've been taught about socialism and communism for almost 100 years has been totally distorted and warped by the people in power, like so much of the information that we have. That's why I don't believe that capitalism can work, because as long as the rich control so much, the media in our society, politicians, they're in control of the message that we receive. And unless we have a highly educated population who is able and has the resources and access to understand and learn and research on their own, we're always going to be at the mercy of those with the most money and power. And that's why capitalism can't work. Because built into capitalism is all of this. It's supposed to deliver equality, but by the mere structure of it, it delivers inequality. As long as those in power have that much control, they have control over our thinking and our knowledge and our understanding of things. So socialism was really about answering the call of what capitalism failed to deliver: equality, freedom, and fraternity. We have none of those things really in society today. We can't say we have equality when 1% of the wealthiest people in the United States own 40% of the wealth. The bottom 90% of Americans own less than 1/4 of the wealth in this country. That means 1% owns 40% of the wealth. The bottom 90% own about 1/4 of the wealth. That's not equality. That's not freedom. How can you have freedom if you're a slave to your paycheck to pay your rent and put food on your table and working 3 minimum wage jobs? Socialism sought and still seeks to have a more equal distribution of wealth or capital and income, and a democratic distribution of power. So socialism, let me say that again, socialism strives for a more equal distribution of wealth, income, and a democratic or equal distribution of power. We do not have those things today. And what's so wrong about wanting those things and trying to get those things for us, for the workers, for the people who are making the richest rich? For the people who say, I just pulled myself up by the bootstraps, but had resources and had privileges and things that many of us didn't have. If it were truly equal, if capitalism truly were the answer, and it was true that if you just worked hard, you could prosper, you could do great in a capitalist society, we would have more than 1% of our society earning 40% of the wealth. Right? Don't you think? Are you saying that so 1% of society owns 40% of the wealth? So are you saying that 1% are only the ones who work hard? That there's something different about them that makes them, I don't know, work harder? No. That's not it. It's just that capitalism in its very nature is unequal, and socialism wants to fix that through the equal distribution of wealth, equal decision making about what gets produced, how it gets produced, and how the profits are distributed. Wouldn't it be great to have a society in which everyone is a participant, everyone is active, everyone is making decisions about what's best for ourselves, our families, our communities, our country, and our globe, our earth? Imagine that, instead of the people at the very top making all those decisions for us. I'm going to leave you with one more thought on this subject. As I see it, I definitely think that the United States should be going more in a democratic socialist direction. Socialism based on the facts about what socialism is, and not about what a fascist dictator, Stalin, said it is, and what those in power in the United States want you to believe it is. Remember, just like the kings who said they were ordained by God, that God gave them their position of power and it was your godly duty. The Bible says, the Catholic Church said, you are a serf, you are a peasant, and that is who you are supposed to be, to keep enriching me because I am the steward of the land. I am here because God said I should be here to take care of the land. Are we still going to continue that train of thought that the 1% deserves to be there by some predetermined or, some lie, some philosophy that isn't true for most of us? Are we going to continue to believe that, or are we going to start fighting for ourselves? And it doesn't have to be a violent revolution. It can be about creating another political party and voting those people into power. But we're seeing what's happening now. That's another story. But here's how I see it. I did some research on some articles about employee-owned businesses. And right now, they're struggling to be competitive. They're struggling to succeed. But this is, and I know that a lot of you might look at those and say, well, socialism obviously isn't going to work, because look at these businesses. They can't even make it work. In a small business, they can't have they can't thrive and they can't make it work. Here's my thought on that. We as Americans have had 200 years of training to be good workers. We start in kindergarten. We go to school Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. We're taught to memorize, not to think. We're taught to obey, to listen to the leader who is the teacher. We all just sit there at our desks. We listen to the teacher. Not a whole lot of interaction, not a whole lot of free thinking. We have to abide by the rules of the school. We have to abide by certain dress codes. We have to do homework. And there's not a whole lot of room in most American schools for free thinking or free acting or for individualism, right? It's all about training us to be good workers. Think about it. It is. What if, instead of our schools and our society indoctrinating us to be good workers, they teach us how to be good citizens? They teach us how to do things in a more collaborative, more socialist, more social way. They teach us how to work together in teams. They teach us Robert's Rules of Orders. Anybody know Robert's Rule of Order? I didn't learn it until college, actually, and it was an extracurricular activity I was on the president of Honor Society, well, before that. Anyway, why isn't that taught in school so that we know how to run effective meetings? Because, you know why? Because we're the minions, and the bigwigs run the meetings. We don't need to know how to do that. But what if we started early? What if we started training our youth how to be more responsible, conscious, active members of our society instead of robots going to work for the industrialists, for the capitalists. And teaching how to run a meeting, teaching negotiation skills, teaching communication skills, teaching entrepreneurial skills, teaching how to start a business, how to be in a business, teaching about community affairs and global affairs and things that really could make us all work together better instead of working separately in our silos really for somebody else. Imagine in a couple generations if we taught those skills in school and in college instead of just how to go to work and be a good worker. Then maybe we could have a better socialist based democracy. Right now, it's not going to work because we've all been conditioned to just toe the line, to do what we're told, to not think too much, to not ask too many questions. We haven't been given the skills and the tools that we need to be able to think for ourselves. And I see that every day. But if we start now in training young adults how to do that, then in a generation or two, we can have a more social nation. We can have a more social structure, a democratic socialism, in which there is an equal distribution of wealth, equal responsibility, and equal say for what's produced, how it's produced, and how the profits are distributed. But we all need basic business acumen to be able to make those decisions. And that's what's lacking now, and that's why a lot of what I have read, a lot of the employee-owned businesses aren't doing very well. They're not as productive, they're not as innovative, they're not as competitive, because we are asking a bunch of people who've been trained to not think, to just be robots and go. We're asking them now to do something that they don't know how to do. But I think we should change that. Okay, so that's it. That is my not so brief history of socialism and socialism and communism and capitalism. I know I just gave a very rough overview of all of these topics. I highly recommend, if this is something that you're interested in, if you're interested in making the economy and our government better for everyone, start with some of the resources that I put below. This is really important, and I think it's really important that we dig deeper and we start to question, why is socialism why are people saying it's so bad? And to look at Russia and say, yeah, that's not socialism. They only got halfway there. They did not implement the final part of socialism, which is putting the control of everything into the hands of the people. They basically just made the people slaves to the state instead of slaves to the capitalist. So that's my little talk on socialism. If you enjoyed this talk and you want to hear more about what I have to say about history and social issues and current events, be sure to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss a thing. I hope you enjoyed this talk. Leave your thoughts below. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you next time. Bye.